Thank you. Damien Hines.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, Secretary of State. Obviously, this is not the pre-legislative scrutiny today, but I did want to take the opportunity to ask you a couple of questions about principle in terms of the intent of the bill. So the white paper was called Online Harms, and traditionally this subject has been called online harms, but gradually over the months the term online safety has been used, and obviously the bill has been introduced as the online safety bill. I'm just interested to know, obviously no one could object to the pursuit of safety, but I'm interested to know what was the development that led to that change of name and why, and what should we read into it?
I would say don't read a great deal into it. I think as a former Secretary of State, you'll appreciate that one of the things that you debate with a bill is what to call it in order to... With a bill, you want the bill to do what it says on the tin. And I think the greatest risk we were trying to deal with here was in order to make the internet safer, particularly, for example, for children. And we just felt that the online safety bill was perhaps a more accurate way than online harms, but between harms and safety, it's not intended to signal that there's been a fundamental shift in the scope of the bill. And indeed, I think you'll see that the bill is broadly similar to how we outlined we would be progressing with the full government response just before Christmas.
So obviously, there's a lot of material to go through. The explanatory notes run through over 100 pages, and we've only sort of just seen it. So I don't think any of us yet, well, you will, but none of the rest of us yet sort of grasp all the detail. But there is a section that defines an affected person as a member of a class or group of people with a certain characteristic targeted by the content. So I'm wondering does the definition of safety mean that there must be a specific individual and a specific occasion of harm?
Well, yes, I think it's worth sort of stepping back as to the two harms that we've identified. That's physical, severe physical or psychological harm, and that has to be to an individual, not to society at large. That is a distinction we have made with the bill in order again to try and give it some sort of scope and shape. And when we set out in the secondary legislation those specific harms, they will be shaped around that. So just to take one example of it, say misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation and disinformation can cause wider societal harms. It's quite difficult to define the scope of that, whereas if, for example, misinformation or disinformation relates to, say, anti-vax, that will cause significant harm to an individual. So therefore, I will wait till we make the final decisions on specific harms, but I'd imagine it would be in scope by virtue of that.
So as it happens, that was the very example I was going to put to you. When you have the propagation of misinformation, which cannot be said to have a health harm to an individual, but is designed either to erode people's trust in institutions or just to make them dislike each other more, to sow the seeds of dissent and confusion, that would not be within the scope of the bill as intended.
Well, it would have to fit into one of those two categories that I outlined, so the physical harm or the psychological harm. And if it didn't, I wouldn't expect it to be in scope, because we just have made decisions about the... because I think, and this obviously was something that preoccupied quite a lot of my time, and indeed previous ministers, and the view was that, and again, this is one of the sort of, there's three balances I've sought to try and get through this bill, where the number one thing is how do we protect individuals, and I'm particularly moved and affected by cases like Molly Russell speaking to her father, Ian Russell. How can we protect against that? At the same time, how can we make sure that we have a proportionate impact on business? We're a highly successful tech sector in the UK. I don't want to put unnecessary burdens on them. And also, though, and I think crucial in this respect, how do we ensure free speech, free expression, free debate, all the things that are fundaments of our liberty and make this country such an attractive place to live in? And I think that there is a risk that if you allow it to become too nebulous, you bring in all sorts of wider debate into scope.
So the second principal question I wanted to bring up with you is actually something we talked about on a previous occasion in this committee, and that's the distinction between insisting that platforms obviously should uphold their own terms and conditions, and having a view about what those terms and conditions should be in the first place. And when we talked about this before, I think you were clear in saying clearly the second part of that matters too, what those rules are. But in the legislation, I think it says or anticipates in secondary legislation that individual harms will be specified, but not necessarily what should be done about them. And can I give you just two examples to ask how this would work in practice? The first is on self-harm. And clearly it's going to be required that platforms say how they will protect children from harmful content in that regard. But as you know, platforms have different policies on self-harm, and they categorise different images in different ways as recovery, photography, for example, as opposed to glorification, which is in a completely separate category. It's possible that society might take a different view. There might be a body of research evidence that says just the sheer prevalence of self-harm discussion and imagery on the internet is causing some worsening of that problem. So in that scenario, does Ofcom have a role to intervene to insist that a different approach is taken? The second example I would ask you about is about journalistic content, and quite right that there should be a carve-out for journalistic content for freedom of expression. There's a real democratic interest in that. But different platforms could interpret that in different ways. Does Ofcom have a role in saying where you draw the line, how you draw the circle around what counts as journalistic content?
Yes, is the short answer to both of those. There's sort of three tiers of intervention. So there is the overall principles set out in primary legislation. There are then the specific harms and indeed codes that are set out through secondary legislation. And then Ofcom will in turn produce its own codes, which will be subject, by the way, to ministerial oversight. And so if you take those two examples, if you take, for example, the self-harm issue, if Ofcom felt that we've deliberately built in flexibility, so to allow each platform that knows their platform better than anyone else the best way of dealing with it. I don't think it would be appropriate in order to have proportionate legislation to prescribe,
No, I wasn't suggesting
exactly which way, either in legislation or secondary. But what we would say then, Ofcom would look at it and say, is this sufficient to address this harm? And if it didn't feel it was sufficient, it would be able to challenge, and if they failed to comply, then they would be not in compliance with the law and then ultimately face sanctions. Similar thing for journalistic content.
Thank you. That's very helpful, Secretary of State. Now, can I ask about something else which perhaps goes to the heart of this distinction between harms and safety, and that's the way that news is presented. And as we all know, quality news costs, and therefore fair remuneration for quality news, including foreign coverage and in-depth coverage, is very important. And prominence is also important for reputable news sources, whereas on the internet there is a tendency for this concept called brand flattening, where everything ends up being treated kind of the same, and those things that generate the most, the highest number of clicks will tend to get preference. Now, following the Australian case, I understand this is a matter for the Digital Markets Unit, but the DMU requires legislation to be instituted. I think originally the plan was there was going to be consultation the first half of this year. So my simple question is, when will this happen, and what do you envisage the scope of DMU powers in that area to be?
So the Digital Market Unit has been set up already within the CMA.
But it needs a statutory footing to do some of these things.
So it has been set up in the CMA at the beginning of this financial year, so the beginning of April. The next step is to consult and then legislate for those powers. We expect the legislation for those powers to be a third session bill. and we will consult in advance of that. That's the joint BEIS and DCMS consultation. In terms of the approach we've taken, I had extensive conversations with my Australian opposite number around this. We've taken a slightly different approach in that I think the issue of fair remuneration for news content is symptomatic of market concentration and potentially market abuse by operators in this sector. Indeed, there's evidence of that from work done by the CMA and others. So I think we need to take a holistic approach, and the government policies take a holistic approach to look at is there a lack of competition, is there an abuse of that dominant market position, and then look at that in each sector. And the two areas that I've asked initially the DMU to look at is news and advertising, whereas the Australians sort of went straight for legislation in relation to that individual issue.
But I think we know that who the DMU has, broadly speaking, in their sights because of this phrase. It's a strategic market status. Yeah. And clearly, in things like the way people consume news these days, there is a very clear, very short list of sort of intermediary channels to look at. Ditto on advertising, whereas there's cross ownership, vertical and horizontally integrated. But just to be clear on the timing. So when might we expect this system to actually be in place? So that, and assuming that DMU's role would be as a backstop to impose a remuneration formula if none could be agreed between the parties, when could we expect that actually to be in operation?
Well, first of all, I would take issue with the assumption that you've made. There are a range of powers that are available to a competition body, and I certainly wouldn't prejudge which ones they would take, and we need to make sure they had that full panoply of powers. We're moving at pace and doing these things in parallel. So, first of all, we went from a position where there wasn't really... The DMU didn't exist, and we hadn't even announced it. I think it was the Chancellor formally announced it in the budget last year. We've got it up and running this year. They're working now. What they don't have are the powers at the end of the process for enforcement. So that's why we'll be consulting through this year into next, and then have the primary legislation that will actually put those powers on statutory footing. Once they have them on statutory footing, once the power is enacted, they'll be able to use them. It won't be the case that we are then waiting to set up the DMU.
So forgive me pushing it. What does all that add up to? When can we expect it to actually be live?
Once the legislation has completed, and that's a third session bill, I can't tell you exactly right now when the third session bill will complete its passage through the House, but that is the ballpark of where we're going with it.
And finally, for me, because I know I need to hand over to Julie Elliott, something which links these two subjects is media literacy. And I'm first to say, by the way, I don't think media literacy is the solution to all our woes, as I think is sometimes assumed, but nevertheless is an important complement to a lot of this work. What progress is there on the media literacy strategy? When can we expect to see that?
This year you will get the media literacy strategy.
This year.